Look, everybody is asking the same question right now. Will the United States and Iran finally reach an agreement? Will tensions in the Middle East suddenly disappear? Will global oil markets calm down? And most importantly, are we witnessing the beginning of peace? But guys, I think we are asking the wrong question. Because sometimes in geopolitics, the biggest mistake people make is focusing on the announcement instead of the environment around the announcement. Think about it. History has shown us many times that a signature on paper does not automatically change reality on the ground. Peace agreements can be announced, leaders can shake hands, cameras can flash, and headlines can celebrate diplomatic breakthroughs. But if the underlying tensions remain unresolved, those agreements can become temporary pauses rather than permanent solutions. And that's exactly why we need to zoom out and look at the bigger picture. Because while much of the world's attention is focused on Washington and Tehran, there are several other actors whose decisions could completely reshape the outcome. This is important. When people study international politics, they often imagine diplomacy as two countries sitting across a table negotiating their differences. But modern geopolitics doesn't work like that anymore. There are regional powers, proxy networks, economic interests, military alliances, energy markets, and domestic political pressures all operating simultaneously. In other words, there are players at the table, and there are players who can flip the entire table over. Does that make sense? Now think about this. Even if the United States and Iran reach some form of understanding, can every regional actor be expected to suddenly stop pursuing its own interests? Probably not. Because every country has its own security calculations. Israel has its own priorities. Iran has its own strategic objectives. The United States has domestic political goals. Arab Gulf countries have economic concerns. China has energy concerns. Europe has inflation concerns. And all these interests overlap in a way that makes a simple peace narrative extremely complicated. Here's where it gets interesting. One possible explanation is that what we're witnessing is not a final settlement, but rather a temporary cooling period. Not because everyone suddenly trusts each other, not because decades of hostility disappeared overnight, but because every side may need time. Time to stabilize their economies, time to regroup politically, time to reassess military capabilities, time to prepare for future scenarios. Guys, throughout history, this has happened repeatedly. Temporary agreements are sometimes used to reduce immediate pressure, while deeper strategic rivalries continue beneath the surface. And this doesn't necessarily mean anybody is acting dishonestly. It simply means countries often separate short-term needs from long-term ambitions. Now think about this. If a nation is under economic pressure, it may seek sanctions relief. If another country wants lower energy prices, it may seek negotiations. If a government wants a political victory, diplomacy becomes attractive. Everyone can have different reasons for supporting the same agreement. But different motivations do not automatically create lasting peace. This is where geopolitics becomes fascinating, because the same document can mean completely different things to different people. One government may present it as a victory, another may describe it as a compromise, another may call it a strategic pause, another may portray it as an opportunity to rebuild, and suddenly everyone is celebrating the same event while believing entirely different things about its purpose. Now understand this, that creates uncertainty. And uncertainty is one of the most powerful forces in international politics. Markets hate uncertainty. Investors hate uncertainty. Shipping companies hate uncertainty. Energy importers hate uncertainty, because uncertainty itself can become a weapon. Let's talk about the Strait of Hormuz. Guys, this tiny stretch of water is one of the most important places on Earth. If you look at a map, it doesn't appear impressive. It's narrow, it's small, it looks insignificant. But appearances are deceiving, because an enormous amount of global energy flows through this corridor every single day. Countries thousands of miles away depend on what happens there. Japan depends on stability there. China depends on stability there. India depends on stability there. Europe depends on stability there. Even people who never think about the Middle East are affected by what happens there every single day. Now think about this. What if the issue is not whether the strait closes completely? What if the issue is that it becomes permanently unpredictable? That's a different conversation. Because global trade does not require total shutdowns to suffer damage. It only requires enough uncertainty to increase costs. Imagine being a shipping company. You don't know if tomorrow will be calm or dangerous. You don't know whether insurance premiums will rise. You don't know whether military escorts will be needed. You don't know whether routes will become politically sensitive. Suddenly your costs increase. Then energy prices increase. Then transportation costs increase. Then inflation spreads around the world. One small area can create global consequences. This is important because geopolitical power is not always about controlling territory. Sometimes it's about influencing confidence. Confidence is an invisible asset. As long as investors believe trade routes are safe, the global system functions smoothly. Once confidence starts disappearing, everything becomes more expensive. Now let's zoom out even further. For decades, the global economy has operated under a certain assumption. That assumption is simple. Major trade routes will remain accessible. Powerful countries will guarantee freedom of navigation. Energy will continue flowing, and markets can plan accordingly. But when that assumption begins to weaken, people start asking new questions. Can alternative routes be developed? Can countries diversify energy supplies? Can regional powers gain more leverage? Can dependence be reduced? These are the questions shaping the future. Not tomorrow, not next week, over the next decade. Now let's talk about another important factor that often gets ignored: domestic politics. Guys, governments are not single unified machines. Inside every government, there are different factions, different opinions, different institutions, different priorities. Diplomats may want negotiations. Military officials may prefer deterrence. Economic planners may prioritize stability. Political leaders may think about elections. National security advisors may focus on long-term threats. All these groups influence decision-making simultaneously, and sometimes they disagree with each other. This is true everywhere: in democracies, in authoritarian systems, in hybrid political systems. Internal disagreements are normal. That's why foreign policy often looks contradictory. One day tensions escalate, the next day negotiations resume, then new sanctions appear, then new diplomatic talks begin. To outsiders, it looks confusing, but from the inside, multiple institutions are competing for influence. Now think about this. If there are divisions inside multiple governments at the same time, how easy is it to create permanent peace? The answer is obvious. It becomes incredibly difficult, because every agreement has to survive internal politics before it can survive international politics. This is where many people underestimate the challenge. They assume signing an agreement is the finish line. Actually, it is often the starting line. After that comes implementation. After implementation comes verification. After verification comes trust building. And trust building can take years, sometimes decades. Guys, look at history. There are countless examples of agreements collapsing because expectations were unrealistic. People expected immediate transformation, immediate trust, immediate cooperation. But international relationships rarely work that way. Trust is built slowly. Suspicion disappears slowly. Historical grievances fade slowly. Now think about another issue: military deterrence. Countries often negotiate while simultaneously preparing for worst-case scenarios. That sounds contradictory, but it is actually normal. Governments rarely stop planning for contingencies, even during diplomacy, because leaders have to prepare for both success and failure. Imagine being a policymaker. Would you bet your entire country's security on optimism? Of course not. You would prepare for every possible outcome: successful negotiations, failed negotiations, escalation, de-escalation, unexpected events, everything. And that's why military preparations can continue even while diplomats are talking. Now, some analysts suggest this creates a dangerous cycle, because one side sees defensive preparations and interprets them as offensive intentions. Then they respond with their own preparations. Then suspicion grows. Then trust shrinks. This cycle can repeat endlessly. This is called the security dilemma. One side says, we are protecting ourselves. The other side says, they are preparing to attack us. Both sides believe they are acting defensively, yet tensions increase anyway. Now think about this. What happens if this dynamic continues for years? The answer is a permanent state of competition. Not full-scale war, not full-scale peace, something in between, a gray zone. And many experts believe this gray zone is becoming the new normal. This doesn't apply only to the Middle East, it applies globally. Look at great power competition, look at energy competition, look at technology competition. The world is entering an era where rivalries may persist without necessarily becoming direct wars. And that changes everything, because stability becomes harder to define. Now let's return to energy. Energy has always been connected to power. Countries that produce energy gain influence. Countries that control routes gain influence. Countries that protect routes gain influence. and countries dependent on imports become vulnerable. This is why the world watches the Gulf region so carefully, not because of geography alone, but because geography and economics are inseparable. Now think about this. If uncertainty becomes permanent, countries will adapt. China may diversify imports. India may seek new partnerships. Europe may accelerate renewable energy projects. Japan may expand strategic reserves. Everyone will start adjusting, and these adjustments will reshape global power balances. Guys, this is how international systems evolve, not through one giant event, but through thousands of small decisions. One insurance company changes its policy. One country signs a new energy agreement. One corporation shifts investments. One government expands reserves. Then gradually, the global landscape transforms. Most people never notice this process happening because it's slow, but slow changes can create enormous consequences. Now here's another important point. We should be careful not to oversimplify any country. Iran is not one single voice. Israel is not one single voice. America is not one single voice. Every country contains multiple perspectives, and understanding those differences is essential, because if we reduce entire nations to simplistic narratives, we miss reality. Reality is messy. Reality is complicated. Reality is uncomfortable. That's why geopolitical analysis requires patience. Now let me ask you something. What will matter more 10 years from now? The headline announcing an agreement or the structural changes happening underneath it? I would argue the second one, because headlines disappear, structures remain, energy routes remain, military doctrines remain, economic systems remain, and those systems shape the future. Guys, that's where our attention should be, not only on dramatic announcements, but on long-term patterns, because patterns reveal more than headlines. And right now, the pattern suggests the world is entering a period of prolonged strategic competition. Competition over energy, competition over influence, competition over security, competition over economic resilience. That does not mean catastrophe is inevitable. Far from it. It simply means uncertainty will remain part of the global environment. Now think about this. What happens if future agreements succeed? That's possible. What happens if future negotiations fail? That's possible too. What happens if tensions fluctuate for years without a final resolution? That may actually be the most realistic scenario. Because international politics rarely offers permanent endings. It offers temporary arrangements, temporary stability, temporary understandings. Then new circumstances emerge, and the cycle begins again. Guys, that's the lesson history keeps teaching us. The world is not moving toward a simple destination. It is constantly adjusting, constantly negotiating, constantly competing. And the countries that adapt fastest often gain advantages. So instead of asking whether one agreement will solve everything, perhaps we should ask a different question. What kind of world is being built underneath these negotiations? Because that is the real story. That is the bigger picture. That is the conversation most people are missing. And once you start seeing the world this way, headlines begin to look different. Suddenly, every announcement becomes one piece of a much larger puzzle. Every military move matters. Every economic decision matters. Every diplomatic statement matters. And the future becomes less about a single event and more about interconnected systems. So yes, negotiations matter. Diplomacy matters. Leadership matters. But understanding the broader strategic environment matters even more. Because in geopolitics, peace is not simply the absence of conflict. Peace is the presence of sustainable incentives that make conflict unnecessary. And creating those incentives is one of the hardest challenges any generation of leaders will ever face. The next few months may provide temporary answers, but they will also raise new questions. And perhaps that is the biggest lesson of all. The world is not asking whether one agreement will change history. The world is asking whether the international system itself is entering a new era. And guys, that is a question far bigger than any single leader, any single country, or any single announcement.